Welcome to Enlightened Omnivore, the monthly podcast that serves up a delicious mix of food, sustainability, and travel. I'm your host, Steve Sabaker, here to explore the wonders of mindful eating. Join me each month as I dig into the stories behind our food system, discover new ways to live sustainably, and embark on culinary adventures around the globe or right in your very own kitchen. Get ready to expand your palate and your mind, one bite at a time. This is Enlightened Omnivore, everything in moderation. Hey everyone, it's Steve Sabaker with Enlightened Omnivore. You know, I spend a lot of time exploring food and sustainability in my writing, but I haven't gotten to take on some big issues here on the podcast. Food policy like the Farm Bill, food stamps, and agricultural subsidies sometimes feels a bit overwhelming to folks. So that's why I'm super excited for my guest today, Austin Frerick. Austin has written the book Barons: Money, Power, and the Corruption of the American Food System. This book has gotten a ton of praise from both sides of the aisle because Austin's taking on an important issue: the food we eat every day. And he says the system's falling apart. He even says the USDA, the Department of Agriculture, should be scrapped. We need to do something to change the way we grow, sell, and regulate the food we eat. The title of Austin's book harkens back to the Gilded Age of robber barons from the 19th century, who by hook or by crook built enormous fortunes. Today, we have a handful of modern-day agricultural barons who are doing the same exact thing, but with our food supply, negatively impacting access, choice, price, and quality. Austin is a fellow at the Thurman Arnold Project at Yale University, and he's advised several presidential candidates and President Biden on agricultural policy. He's worked for the U.S. Treasury and the Congressional Research Service, and he's a seventh-generation Iowan, so he knows a little bit about agriculture firsthand, especially from working his grandfather's farm on the weekends when he was a kid in his home state. So let's dive right in to uncover the layers of our food system with Austin. Thanks for joining us, Austin.
Yeah, thanks for having me on.
You know, let's get right down to it because your book is really fascinating and there's a lot of pieces to get through. You talk about these 7 barons of the food system that you say hold a lot of power and control over the food we eat and the prices we pay. Could you share a couple of your favorite examples of how these families and private companies are controlling our food system?
Yeah. So let me just start by saying, so the way I thought about each baron is, I have 7 barons, as you said in my book, and they're each built around a structure. Like I really want to tell you a bigger structural story in the food system with each baron. So to me, the best example of this, honestly, is Walmart. And to be frank with you, Walmart was not in my original plan for this book. I mean, they are my grocery baron, and I view them as the king of kings just because, I mean, I've gone to Walmart to get groceries, but I've never thought of them as a grocery store. But 60% of their sales comes from the grocery store. They sell 1 of your groceries, which is the same as the second, third, fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and eighth combined. Just for context, Trader Joe's has like a 1% market share. So their market power is insane. But I had a lot of people in the grocery industry tell me it's with Walmart, it's supply and command. You don't negotiate with them. They dictate to you. And like I kind of almost I intellectually think of them as the closest thing we have in America to a Soviet Union style Politburo. They just have so much market power. And the scary thing about Walmart too is the creation of one robber baron tends to create other robber barons. So like that's how Driscoll's, I argue, became a robber baron, is they saw the rise of Walmart, where in order to just have some bargaining power, they got big. And they realized one company wants 4 berries year round for 4,000 stores.
Yeah, so this is Driscoll's the berry brand that you see in all these grocery stores. But I think you mentioned in the book, they don't even own farms, right?
No, they don't grow a single berry. They own the intellectual property of the berry. They own like the patents, the genetics, whatever you want to call it. It's almost like the Silicon Valley model. That's like the nice way of looking at it. The dark way of looking at it is sharecropping. You know, it's very much a model that comes out of historically in the South. It's really exploitive. That way, the hardest part of anything in that chain is actually growing the berry. So by outsourcing it to someone else, you can be naive to labor and environmental exploitations. So what we've seen, I argue, since I focused on the 1996 Farm Bill, is basically an offshoring of a lot of produce in America. So anything that's labor intensive has moved offshore, where you can basically exploit labor. That's why you've seen much more nut production in California, just because that is capital intensive, not labor intensive.
And I mean, labor is a huge piece of this. I can only imagine. You talk about these monopolies like Walmart and Driscoll's. How does this happen? Obviously, as they get bigger and bigger, regardless of what they do, they make huge impacts on the economy. How did our food system get so consolidated in the first place?
I really think it goes back to the 1980s, the election of President Reagan, and how he ushered in basically a laissez-faire framework. And let me also just say, it's such a simple thing, but it took me a while to realize that the goal of any corporate executive is monopoly. That's where profits are. And what you've seen basically is things were deregulated. All these guardrails to maintain competition, went away. You've seen massive consolidations where, as companies get economic power, they wield political power to essentially lock in their dominance through regulatory capture. And to me, you best see that in the meatpacking industry, where a lot of the big meat giants, push USDA to do a lot of meat regulations that essentially prevents new market entrants.
You talk a lot about what you call the Wall Street Farm Bill. I mean, could you give us a
Mhm.
little bit of a background on the USDA, which I find is, the size and scope of the USDA, I think would surprise a lot of people. I remember when I lived in Washington, D.C., I was taking language classes at the USDA. So they have like a language program that, for whatever reason, who knows how it ended up in their appropriations bill, but they run all of the language classes for like the State Department and the
Huh.
military. So I went and took the class. I wasn't in any of those organizations, but I just wanted to learn some French while I lived there. And I was like, what am I doing at the USDA? But you talk about how it started in the Civil War, and then the impact of kind of the New Deal and the New Deal Farm Bill, and then the Wall Street Farm Bill, what you call, which I think is fascinating. Could you give us a little bit of a history on that and how we got here from there, and what is the USDA, and what is its focus now, and what is its purpose?
Yeah, well, first of all, I didn't know that about the foreign language thing. But yeah, to your question, so I mean, USDA goes back to the Civil War, and really its origin was a distributor of information. Here's how to grow things. Here's conservation tips. Really wasn't that big. It really changed during the New Deal, where in the 1920s, because of World War One and a lot of European farmland taken out of production because of the land war, American farmers really increased production. So then after the war ended, these markets were glutted. On top of it, you had these various like the Dust Bowl, these various environmental crises. And so you had farmers engaging in really destructive environmental practices in order to save the land because the markets were glutted. So there was just like this death spiral of overproduction. So the New Deal Farm Bill comes along and was really rooted in what I call like Goldilocks, where sure you get a little subsidy, but in order to get the subsidy, you basically have to take some land out of production. You have to engage in some conservation practices. So essentially, the government was trying to figure out that sweet spot of production of making sure enough food was being produced, farmers were getting a good price, but not gluttoning these markets. And also, there was caps on how much you could get, but the key things were that they were interlocked. Um, Here's the thing: my grain. So this whole chapter, I tell this story in my Grain Baron chapter, Cargill, which is the largest private company in America. They are bigger than the Koch brothers. They didn't like this. I mean, they want to move and process as much grain as possible. And so they hated FDR. And basically, I tell how since then you see the systematic assault on the Farm Bill. Basically, we're trying to chip away this kind of Goldilocks framework. And I really focus, as you said, in that 1996 Farm Bill, what I call the Wall Street Farm Bill, where to me, even though you've seen these little structural changes along the way, that to me is where it really shifted. Where now the Farm Bill is designed to overproduce grains at the expense of everything else, because Cargill wants to move and process as much grains as possible. And what that means is basically, first of all, um, the notion of like Goldilocks is gone. And so there a lot of the caps have been raised or eliminated in the instance of crop insurance, but also they're decoupled. So it used to be in order to get subsidies, you had to do conservation. That's gone. And then you also see just a corruption of the programs themselves. Like for the conservation programs, you can essentially get money now called under equip to build an industrial hog manure lagoon and call that conservation. Um, and the one I actually think is the best example of this is crop insurance because it sounds like it's for like, bad weather, but it's really not. It's insurance against low prices, where 60% of the premium is paid for by taxpayers. And unbeknownst to most Americans, like Bill Gates is one of the largest owners of farmland. So Bill Gates can get as much crop insurance as he wants, like basically insurance against low prices, grow corn and soy. But here's the thing: it's only for a few crops. Like USDA is picking favorites. So if you want to grow carrots, you're not getting anything. So it's really pushing farmers to do corn and soy, which is making artificial feed for industrial animals and metal sheds cheap. At the same time, too, it's why highly processed food is much cheaper at the store than fresh food, fruit and vegetables. So essentially, it takes money to eat healthy now in America, and that's by design because this Wall Street Farm Bill. This is the result of that framework of overproduction of grains.
So basically, to summarize, we saw during the New Deal an attempt to support these smaller farmers who were being impacted by both environmental issues and overproduction of certain crops. And then as some of these farmers got bigger, like the Cargills, they wanted to maximize their profits in specific products, focusing mostly on soy and corn. And so did they change that by policy, or did they change? How did they impact the Wall Street Farm Bill, if you will?
So that's fascinating. And that to me is why Cargill's power, most people don't know about them, even though they're, such a powerful company. We all know who the Koch brothers are because they cut big political checks. They give money to the various BS think tanks in DC. Cargill doesn't. Cargill likes to use middleman. I call it the middleman approach, where they'll cut a check to someone else to then do their bidding. So they keep their hands clean. I mean, I was in the Minneapolis, Minnesota capital a few months ago, and that's where Cargill's based, and they even see it there. Like they know, they kind of have a sense when Cargill's fingerprints are on something, but they don't know. And that's what's actually really scary is because they're also a privately traded company, there's not as much disclosures, but you see moments of the darkness show itself. Things like, turns out, for example, Cargill's really big in the corn syrup. Part of this farm bill is we overproduce corn. We had to find new uses for overproduction. Corn syrup was one of them, starting in the 70s. So, they turns out they help finance different academic studies saying, oh, corn syrup's not that bad. That kind of corrupting of the academic literature. At the same time, too, the one that really scared me was a report by Oxfam in the Financial Times about a decade ago, where I forget which country in South America, they went through a civil war where 250,000 people died. And one of their things to rebuild themselves was they enacted a thing about how much land you could own, really prevent that consolidation of land. And then Oxfam discovered that Cargill exceeded that amount by 30 sometimes, through using secret shell companies. And it's just really, to me, it's like the iceberg in the Titanic. You're only seeing the tip of it. And we really just don't know the extent of their power. And the whole chapter is framed around, I think Cargill's the closest thing we have to a modern day Standard Oil. They're all about owning the middle, the movement and processing of grains, because they're not consumer facing. You don't know who they are. But it's also why they're still in Russia to this day, because they don't feel consumer pressure to leave Russia. And that's actually why, the last line of that chapter, it's actually, I think a better comparison to Cargill is actually on the 19th century British Empire, because the sun never sets on their empire.
Is that lack of transparency because they're a private company and they don't have to file with SEC in the same way that public companies do?
Yes, but also, it's also very much of the culture of the organization. And the last thing too is just there hasn't been media attention paid to it. It's really rare to see stories on Cargill. I feel like any business move by the Coke industry, like any purchase gets scrutiny, whereas Cargill is just oh, so what,
Well, I feel like it's the same thing about GE or something like that, where, they're in so many different industries, but the brands don't say GE, don't say Cargill. You don't know what is Cargill and what isn't. You talk a little bit about this with the products that a lot of these companies are producing for other brands. And that I think you said the only way you could tell who was actually making this stuff was when there were recalls. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. I think back in the day, Standard Oil was Standard Oil, didn't have secret little brands. Now we live under this illusion of choice. So take peanut butter. That's my favorite example. You look at a peanut butter case in a grocery store, you see a bunch of brands in what appears to be a competitive market. In reality, Smucker's has a 50, 60% market share because they own a bunch of different brands, including Santa Cruz. The thing, as you said, they actually their market share tends to be much higher because they do a lot of store labels. But you only know that usually when these recalls happen, because they really want to hide that. So their market share is that is the underbelly estimate.
Wow. And so, in peanut butter, how many producers are there? Do you know?
I don't. That's even what's wild about this, I'm even using national figures. I mean, especially for meat and dairy, it's pretty useless to use national figures on this stuff. Like people will say a lot, oh, for companies have like an 80% market share in beef. That doesn't matter to you if you're a Montana beef farmer because it's like you're not going to take if you just have one slaughterhouse in the state of Montana, which I don't know, I'm just using that as an example. You don't take a cattle to like South Carolina to get butchered or Georgia.
Right.
The good example of this to me is there was a paper 2 years ago that showed that one company has an 85% market share in fluid milk in New England and the tri-state area of New York City.
85%.
Yeah.
Wow. And so how does that affect pricing and how, I mean, you're an antitrust expert as well. Like why isn't that something like a red flag to regulators that, hey, wow, 85% of this product is being supplied by one company. Isn't that an antitrust issue?
So two things. Yes, but there's a combination of like the Federal Trade Commission has just been really underfunded for decades. Like it still has less people than when Reagan took office. And you know what I mean? Think of how many millions of people we added to America since then. Same time too, USDA is just to me a voice of agribusiness. Like it's just so captured by industry. It's not even looking at these markets. So much as we just don't know how broken they are. I mean, this isn't what kind of angers me is like this isn't hard data to get. For example, every time you buy something in the store, that grocery store scanner data, it's sold by Wall Street. I've someone leaked it to me for my dairy baron, so could see his sales. Why is USA not looking at that? Why are they not doing market share for fluid milk by each state? I mean, that would be really helpful for people to just so they could be aware of how consolidated these markets are. I mean, it's Congress could easily do a report, telling you the market share of the peanut butter. So I'm not guessing, looking at recalls. They can get this information if they choose to. At the same time, too, everyone's just seeing it's not working because like it's kind of textbook economics where concentrated markets gouge. So like industry will love to say this makes food cheap, but that's just not factually true. When you pull the data from USDA, dollar for dollar, Americans spend more money on food than a lot of other Western democracies. And we're about dollar for dollar for Italy. And like I think anyone that's been to Italy knows a dollar in Italy gets a lot different food than a dollar in America. So we're essentially paying more for junk, but we shouldn't be shocked by that because that's what concentrated markets do. And I mean, if there's one graph I could include in my book, it would be the beef markets, or what you pay for beef goes up and up every year, but what the cattle rancher gets is flat, and that's just the story of monopoly.
Yeah, absolutely. That is definitely something we experienced with our butcher shops that, we work directly with our farmers, and the price that they were getting or the price that they were charging didn't change over several years, but the price that the processors were charging, the slaughterhouses, and then distribution and all those things are much more variable, and those costs are tacked on, and it's really hard for the consumer to know how that steak or ground beef arrives at a grocery store and where it came from. I'm curious, have you seen any compelling policy around sourcing or transparency around that? I mean, I think it's fascinating that other than a recall, we don't know where these peanuts came from or where they were processed. You can look on the back of the label and it might have an address, but, that's the distributor or that's some warehouse. How do we create transparency for even very simple things like produce?
Well, let's start with the premise. These companies do not want transparency. And to me, honestly, going back to meat markets, you see it best there. I mean, I think it's been decades now. We've been fighting to make the label made in USA mean something. Like, I mean, the famous example anecdote is you can buy Brazilian beef from the rainforest, bring it into America, and if you rewrap it, you could put a made in USA label on it. And the fact it's taken decades at this
That's
point
right.
to make that label mean something, which honestly, I don't even know if it means something at this point. I mean, Vilsack says something, but like Vilsack to me is like Harold Hill, the Music Man. He runs his mouth, but his words mean nothing. Um, so I don't know. I mean, that is just it shows you how captured these agencies are, is that they can't do basic things. Like, how is it? I mean, how does it take years to make that label mean something? And to me, even if we improve transparency, that's not going to be enough because even the people doing it right, you're not playing on a level playing field. Like, you cannot compete on price against companies that are using child labor. You just can't. Or even like the Brazilian rainforest beef. There's been enough reporting that there's been slave labor, there's been children used there. Like you just can't, any rancher doing it right cannot compete on price. So you can only run uphill so much. And price transparency helps, but to me, these are bigger structural things. I mean, Transparency would be great. People should know, but there's a bigger thing going on. There's like one thing I wish I talked about more in the book. Labels would be one. Because like I personally don't think the organic label means that much anymore. But I'm also conscious of not, I don't tell that too often to people because it's a mixed bag where like there are people doing it right with organics, but also USDA failed to really police those standards. So like, for example, when I'm in Trader Joe's and I see organic juice from Turkey, I just know it's not, I know it's probably not real. Because like, first of all, Turkey's known for having massive amounts of organic fraud. And like the way this whole system is set up is it's dependent on them to enforce it. And Turkey is like basically a quasi dictatorship. So it's like, also like, what's the point of getting water from halfway around the world? Like it's juice.
I hear you on kind of the skepticism of the organic label. I mean, even like, I have chickens in my backyard and I buy organic feed, but most of that comes from China. And you question, what's the policing agent and where's the integrity to say, oh, this is actually organic feed. And I actually have a friend at one of the local colleges that has done some electron microscope work on some of these products, both meat and grain, and he can tell, like if they have chemical residue, or if they only have grass, if the animals only ate grass and not grain. And you'd be surprised some of the labels that we found that said, 100% grass finished, and corn shows up or soy shows up in their food ration. So yeah, there is a lot of skepticism there, and I'm curious, what do we do then if we can't trust the government halfway around the world that is shipping orange juice in? Okay, we can buy more local, but you're saying that there's even skepticism around kind of how the USDA polices the organic label. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, just to add on to your point, I'm glad you mentioned that little example because Consumer Report just did their last issue or two ago was about that, where a lot of organic produce was having chemicals on it, especially when it was imported.
Yeah.
I'm a big believer in personnel. Like personnel is policy, and like when you elect a president, you're electing thousands of bureaucrats. And I think actually in food, you see the best and worst examples of President Biden's political appointees, where the appointment of a young woman named Lena Khan to the Federal Trade Commission is why, I mean, she's just a game changer. She wants to return us to this old anti-monopoly framework in America. She is, the one filing all those antitrust lawsuits against big tech. She's the one that challenged Albertson Kroger merger. She's a hero. She walks into any law school, the kids adore her. She did an event on fertilizer consolidation in Iowa 2 months ago and got 100 people in a small town in Iowa. And like, what bureaucrat in DC can do that? But on the flip side, Vilsack is the best example to me of, the worst of, I would argue he's Biden's worst political appointee. I mean, the fact is,
For my listeners, they may not know who Vilsack is. So.
Oh yeah, Vilsack is a current Secretary of Agriculture under President Biden. He also was a Secretary of Agriculture under President Obama. Between administrations, he made $1 million a year as an industrial dairy lobbyist. And then before that, before the Obama administration, he was actually governor of Iowa for 2 terms. So we go back. So it's here's the thing with Vilsack. Like, let's be frank, there's not really been a lot of great USDA secretaries going back decades now. But like everyone always likes to poo-poo on Earl Butz, Secretary Nixon's Secretary of Agriculture, because he famously said, "Get big or get out." And here's the thing: he was never pretending to be the friend of the farmer. He straight up was in the pocket of industry, and he didn't hide it. People like Vilsack say, "I'm here to help you," and then they stab you in the back. He's been talking about consolidation in meat packing, but the fact is, these last 4 years, the meat markets have gotten more concentrated in America. You've had all the big players make acquisitions. On top of it, Walmart's even irked by the gouging it's facing from these meat monopolies. It's making vertical plays into beef itself. And so, first of all, we shouldn't be dependent on Walmart to save us because the USA is incompetent at doing basic things. Also, this isn't rocket science. We did this a century ago. Like when you learn about monopolies in school, you kind of learn about Teddy Roosevelt meat packing. Like we're not talking AI, we're talking hogs. To me, it's just a failure to have political courage to do something simple. On top of it, I have a whole section on this in the book. My slaughtering baron is this Brazilian company, JBS. They are the largest meat packer the world's ever seen. They're number one in beef, number one in chicken, number 2 in pork, number 1 in leather. And right before the 2020 election, they pled guilty to bribing over 1,800 Brazilian politicians to become a monopoly. And like, I'm not talking campaign contributions. I'm talking like straight up bribery, like including a Manhattan apartment. Vilsack let them keep their monopoly. Vilsack still gives them USDA contracts. They got bigger under his watch. Like I've not seen a more bipartisan pinata in modern political times in America than reforming the meat markets. You have Josh Hawley working with Elizabeth Warren on this. You have children being used in these slaughterhouses. You have workers being really exploited during COVID. You have ranchers screaming for help. You have people irked at the grocery store. Yet you have the incompetency and corruption of a Secretary of Agriculture who just wants to be a lobbyist again.
Wow. You talk a lot about monopolies. What about monopsonies? This was an interesting term, and I really enjoyed this part of the book. But can you talk a little bit about how this is another way to control the monopsony? Can you share a little bit of that?
Yeah. So I learned about this term doing my college thesis. I'm from Iowa, went to college in Iowa, and I decided to write my college thesis on slaughterhouse towns in Iowa. I found them so fascinating. They are a lot of these schools and that the old towns have 78% non-white students, very high poverty, very high English as a second language. So I spent summer going to my senior year, talking to clergy, talking to the principals, talking to teachers, various community members, being like, what's going on here? Um, and that's where I learned this term monopsony from my professor, where so we know monopoly is when there's only one seller of something, like one seller of widgets. Monopsony is there's only one buyer of something. So in these instances, these meat packers are only buyer of labor in these towns. I kept hearing over and over again from my conversations. I would have principals tell me just all the problems they had dealing with like a high poverty student population. But then they would always tell me how great the slaughterhouse was because they got free hot dogs for their back to school bash. There was that disconnect between like, oh, if your workers were paid more, you wouldn't have this, which really reminded me of company towns of Appalachia.
Sure.
I had one principal tell me straight up, or superintendent, I should say, at least they have an employer. A lot of these other towns don't, are just shriveling up. Where like actually some of these towns are actually growing because birth rates are higher in these towns. So I mean, there's just an exploitation of power that you see with monopsony. Then you just add on the fact that a lot of these workers are usually undocumented, just compounds that power imbalance.
So is this an overt strategy to kind of
Yes.
control the labor market?
Yes. I mean, this was an intentional strategy. I mean, and there's been some good academic papers recently on the growth of monopsonies in rural America. It's just like so many people in rural America they don't have many employer options, which really limits their wage growth. Like you can't compete, you can't have different companies compete for your labor and bid up what you make an hour. I tell the history of meatpacking a little bit in that chapter, which to be frank with you, comes from my thesis. But when we think the slaughterhouses, they were originally like in Chicago. And then what you've seen in response to unionization efforts in these slaughterhouse towns was the movement to like mid-sized towns, places like where I come from, Cedar Rapids. It's been underappreciated how much refrigeration changed the food system in America. And the advent of mass refrigeration and trucking in the 50s and 60s really allowed the shifting within of meat packers to these really small towns. Refrigeration allows that one plant in Denison, Iowa to ship it across the country. Um, it's incredibly wasteful, which I didn't appreciate until someone in the grocery business pointed out to me to like have a model that's that intensive.
Is there any policy or legislation that's addressing monopsonies, or do we see them? I mean, from a government and regulatory perspective, they're okay? Like, what? How do we address this with policy?
Good question. When I wrote about this 10, 15 years ago, there was not that much out there. I mean, it was like one of those things you'd find in Britannica, but like there really wasn't that much scholarship going on. You saw it actually show up in the Federal Trade Commission when they successfully challenged, I forget which publisher, some book publisher wanted to buy another book publisher, and they pushed back on labor grounds because of the monopsony of it. It would limit the buyers, the labor market side for authors selling into the book world. But from like a more policy standpoint, you just need to break up companies because when a company has 20 hog slaughterhouses and one group of workers decide to go on strike, well, the company will just shift production elsewhere. You really limit the power of these workers, whereas like a company has 3 or 4 slaughterhouses, they're much more brought to their needs.
The whole book kind of identifies very directly these wealthy, very powerful, kind of unscrupulous people. Are you worried about any repercussions here? Like, I'm a little worried about you outing some of these folks. Have you received any backlash or negative feedback?
I mean, let me just first start by saying like that to me is the beauty of America is I can write a book like that and not worry about my safety. I mean, that's a very unique thing. I think we forget sometimes living here. Um, that I actually honestly forgot until it wasn't I did a book tour across the Midwest back in April. And I pretty much at every stop, I had some older lady ask that version of that question. Like very like it was like a little naive to that of like truly like I think that's part of my personality. I'm a first generation college student. I've always kind of been like aggressive and bullheaded. I'm just kind of angry. I mean, I saw what happened to Iowa in my lifetime. I mean, this is the best soil in the world. This should be the Napa of America for food. Should be the Italy of North America, but second highest cancer rate, one of the most obese states. The countryside doesn't feel like the countryside at all. It's incredibly industrial. It's dead. It's barren. You don't see animals, you smell them. And so to me, it's like it all fell apart. Why not go big? Like, what's there to lose? You know, I mean, I'm your classic millennial. All I have are the books behind me. I don't own any assets. So, if they want them, they can have them. I did have my hog baron respond. My hog baron wrote an op-ed in the Des Moines Register, just really rebuffing, like, oh, they're actually good stewards for the land, yada yada yada. Which, just for your listeners out there, 60 to 70% of the waterways in Iowa are just too polluted to go in, and that's because there's just the land can't handle this much manure going into the waterways. And I actually invited my hog barons. My last book event in Iowa was in their hometown, Iowa Falls. So I invited them to come. They didn't send anyone, and that was like honestly the one time I was scared during this. Like not scared, like the one time where I was like, I actually did on my phone I put on the tracker so my husband could follow me.
In case you disappear.
Yeah, I showed up in the bottom of some manure pit, but well, it's also like I understand at this moment a lot of people are just trying to get by, and like I don't want people, like there are some people in this town who play by them. Like I understand that, and I don't want people to be like, well, I'll be out of a job. I get that. Like I'm trying to be like very conscious of that.
I was going to ask you because I mean, I'm kind of shocked by maybe it's unfair to say the complacency of the public, but you're talking about basically the Hansen family and these confined animal feed operations, these CAFOs, which are basically warehouses that hold all these pigs in really tight confinement, and the manure that they produce, I think you said 3 times as much as human beings every day, has to be pumped into these lagoons that kind of sit out, on the outskirts of the operation. And then when it rains, or if they accidentally spill some of it, it pours into these waterways. And like you said, it's polluting the state's lakes and streams. Yet, I think you said there's like dozens of pieces of legislation for human sewage, but none for hog sewage. Why aren't more people upset about this? I mean, there's 3 million people in Iowa. Why isn't there more outrage about the damage to very simple concepts of waste and water? Like, these are basic necessities. How come we're not seeing more of your neighbors speaking up about this?
So I'm gonna like reframe that a little bit. Where to me, my anger for complacency actually is directed at these elite coastal newspapers. I mean, there's so much copy given to like what's the new elite restaurant, the vegan restaurant that's $400. But to get actual structural industry stories on this stuff, to get reporting on a lot of these shenanigans, you just don't see the coverage. You don't really see people on this beat. Um, I don't think it's fair to say to the people in these regions. I mean, what I really internalized and like point I tried to make in my hog chapter was people fought power and they lost. And there's a degree of Stockholm syndrome in many of these communities. I mean, that's actually where my anger at Vilsack really comes from, is Iowa had a rural revolt when this industrial hog thing was taking hold in the 90s. I mean, it's I think keep in mind your homes are everything in America. And Vilsack, a state senator, voted for this legislation in 1996 in Iowa to basically strip away local control, where now only the governor of Iowa can stop the construction of these hog confinements. You saw this industry taking hold. You saw hog farmers getting mad because you can't compete on price against something cutting all these corners. I mean, these things smell awful. I mean, they attract vultures. 10% of pigs die inside of them. So besides next to everyone is a dumpster full of bloated dead pig bodies. It just kills your quality of life. You had small town gyms in Iowa be filled with thousands of people. The 2002 campaign for governor in Iowa was actually centered on this issue. Vilsack was running as a Democrat, and he was running against the head lobbyist for my hog baron. Vilsack promised to do something. And then after he won, not only did he not do anything, Vilsack oversaw the largest expansion of hog confinements in Iowa history. That destroys people. Like, it's not when people galvanize, when all these activists try to do something, and the person you think is there to help you not only does nothing, but actually undermines you, people are hopeless. I mean, here's the thing: you can go into rural communities now and say, trust busting, do something. to be honest with you, most people don't think are going to do anything. Which, to be fair to them, they've heard these words echoed so many times. We saw this under Obama administration. Phil Saka, Secretary of Agriculture, did hearings on consolidation. He didn't do anything. I mean, John Oliver's done some great episodes on this stuff. So like, we shouldn't be shocked that people are just like, they don't trust anyone on this anymore. Like you almost have to essentially earn their vote, earn their support in this stuff by doing something, then they'll come to you. So it's like the complacency comes from a brokenness because like keep in mind home values in these areas have essentially collapsed. So like usually what happens is their children go to college, move away to Chicago or Minneapolis. They can't afford to move to them because their home value is not worth them much, and they can't afford to move into these higher price urban cities. So these rural areas, these small towns become basically retirement homes, and also with those kids who couldn't make that white collar jump.
Yeah.
I mean, I think politically it's really fascinating that the rural areas of the industrial Midwest, the areas that voted for President Obama twice and then went hard for Trump. And to me, this is that story.
Wow. And I want to talk a little bit about that too, because you do talk about the bipartisan opportunity. So, this book, it's heavy. There's a lot here that kind of can be overwhelming for readers. I felt that sense of hopelessness, in some of the examples. Where do we go from here? I mean, what do you hope your readers take away from Barron's, and how do you see this affecting the broader debate in the food system?
Yes. Let me first start by saying, like, intellectually, I'm a big believer is you have to understand how someone amasses power in order to do something about it. Because what you realize too quickly is a lot of it, most people become barons because they cut corners or cross ethical lines other people weren't willing to cross. So by engaging in this type of exercise, you kind of learn what to do. My hope here is like this system, like as you mentioned early in the intro, I'm intentionally using this Robert Barron framework for people because I want to show people we've been here before. We know what to do here. There's unique bipartisan coalition potentially to do something. And I also just think this system has run itself into the ground. It's gouging people. People are just not seeing its work. I mean, the other thing too, underappreciated about all this is it just makes bad tasting food.
Yeah.
Like that's I did little tastings writing these different chapters and like for example, for me, dairy inputs matter. Like what a cow eats really impacts her milk. And so like when a cow's in a metal shed or a feedlot all day eating corn, their milk is just not going to be as good as like a pasture cow.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think my kids, as we no longer have the butcher shop, so the quality of meat we get is still great, but it's not like what we were getting before directly from these amazing ranches. And my kids are not nearly as excited to eat meat because the flavor has changed. So, okay, what are some of the recommendations? I mean, I think you in your book you talk about eliminating the corn and soy subsidies.
Yeah, my big one there is just I think we should sunset the farm bill as we know it. And I'm not talking about the food assistance. I'm just talking about the farm entitlement programs, the crop insurance, the commodity, and conservation programs.
Yeah, a lot of people probably don't know that food assistance, like food stamps, that's in the farm bill.
Yeah, it goes back to the 1960s. It was a way to tie together urban and rural vote. Here's the thing, like it's like 75-80% of the farm bill is actually food assistance, which to be frank with you at this point is a low wage subsidy for working poor Americans. That's what it is. It's not I lost my job, I'm hungry. It's literally I work for Walmart, the richest family in America, and they're not paying me a living wage. So I need food assistance to use at their store to get by. That's where we are.
Wait, so you're saying they're buying their food from the company they work for with a subsidy program, basically food stamps, because the company doesn't pay them enough to buy food in the open market.
Yes. I think I calculated that my number. The Supreme Court actually made the disclosures of these figures didn't make it's not allowed because for some reason that's proprietary information, which I mean, let's be frank, 6 of these judges are just corporate hacks, but then Justice Kagan joined with them, which for reasons I don't know why. But I calculate based on Walmart's market share and the amount of subs SNAP, it's like $20 billion a year running through the registers. And also I believe I need to check this. I believe Walmart's the largest private employer in America. And so, I mean, they're the richest family in America. They own 2 NFL teams. They own the Chargers and the Broncos. But some days they're also the richest family in the world. Kind of depends on the market. And also, I should also say, just so people understand, they own like 50%, around 50% of Walmart. Jeff Bezos only owns like 10% of Amazon. So they effectively control the company. And so you have this massive subsidy going through them. I didn't really touch on this, but I think it's an underappreciated thing of the food system is a lot of nonprofits in this space are financed by the Walden family. So you see them talk about food security, but there's not really a power critique there. Why are people food insecure? Are they not earning enough? It's because Walmart wants to maintain the food assistance program because it's such a valuable thing for their empire. It's such a valuable subsidy, I should say. And that's, I mean, this study's 10 years old. I reference it in my book where a congressional report estimated about each Walmart employee gets about $5,000 in government assistance because their wages are too low. That's food assistance, but also, housing vouchers, Medicaid, all that kind of stuff.
Wow. Okay. So we don't want to get rid of the food assistance program, but
No,
where's that other money going? It's going to overproduction of corn and soy.
just like the actual farm bill programs, those three, I would phase those out and just take that pot of money and put it into conservation,
And
like a stewardship program.
yeah, what do you define conservation for my listeners?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. I would say, as I mentioned earlier, like USA defines it as conservation money goes to hog manure lagoons at this point. That clearly is not conservation. Uh, I mean, I also mentioned we should strip USA for parts at this point. So maybe have a different, maybe interior define what is conservation. But like you have a set of programs where like, hey, for example, we know that allowing grass to grow around creeks, we know that's good for the environment. Um, Putting cover crop on. So like so that way the fields aren't barren in the winter in the Midwest. You just put some cover crop down so that way it holds the soil in place. Different things like that. So farmers like they can kind of figure out what works best for their land. But I should also say really tying it to people that actually work the land. Because I think forgotten is like most farmland in Iowa is actually owned by non-Iowans at this point. Grandma and grandpa die, kids moved to Long Beach, they put it into a trust, they rent it out. The person renting the land is not going to care for the land in the same way that someone who owns the land farming their land. So like that's like my big thing. It's just like let's stop picking favorites. Let's have stop heavily subsidizing Oreos and move to this more sustainable system. Because the current farm bill does nothing to lower your grocery store prices, and it's worse for the climate because it encourages ethanol, which anyone that thinks ethanol is good for the climate in 2024 thinks the world is flat at this point.
For folks who don't know, a lot of this corn that isn't is so overproduced that it's not used for food, so they actually turn it into fuel to run vehicles, and I think most states have some percentage of ethanol in their fuel mixture, right?
Yeah. So ethanol goes back to that framework of every year we're going to produce more corn. How do we find new uses for it? Ethanol is an artificial demand to drive that surplus. So now, like as you said, most corn now in America is burned in our cars.
Most, like, do you how much?
Uh, it's the largest use. I don't think it's over 50% to my knowledge, but it's the largest use now of corn. I mean,
Wow.
corn's basically used for three things in America. I mean, first of all, corn on the cob is like 1%. Uh, Actually, funny little story for people. I went to college in Iowa, and someone in my dorm is from Seattle. First thing she did during New Student Week was she went out to a cornfield, picked corn, and boiled it in the kitchen. Which me and all the other Iowans looked at her like, "What the hell are you doing? Like, you can't eat that corn." But like, here's the thing: that makes total sense. I understand why she did it. You know what I mean? Like, we all know, growing up in Iowa, it's feed corn. It's industrial corn. Like it's hard. Most corn's either used for ethanol or it's used for feed for these animals in these metal sheds.
And you can't eat that.
You can't eat it. You can't eat it. And then you also have like a chunk of it used for like corn syrup and all that kind of stuff. But like, you do not see edible corn in Iowa. Like, you might, someone will sell it at a gas station, but like when you drive by a field in Iowa, you are not seeing edible corn.
Wow. Wow. So we want to eliminate those subsidies that are overproducing corn and soy. I think you said sell the agency for parts. The USDA needs to be dismantled. What do we replace it with?
First of all, I'm a big believer. The best way to get agencies to do something is to threaten to take away a part of their budget. For example, like the Federal Trade Commission oversees competition protections in most markets in America except meatpacking. USDA has that authority. Take that authority away from USDA and give it to the Federal Trade Commission. It's just clear that USDA is competent at doing something about it. Another thing is, what about taking food stamps, food assistance, and putting it under HHS? Or taking there's like the conservation programs and putting it under Interior.
And then, so getting rid of the Department of Agriculture entirely. Is that what you're suggesting?
Not entirely. I mean, maybe just stripping it for parts, moving things around, taking away some of its authority. Hopefully, by taking some of its authority away, it'll behave well. We could rethink it. I mean, here's the thing: this agency comes out of the Civil War. It's okay to rethink things. You know what I mean? Like the whole Farm Bill framework comes out of like back in the era before like tractors were a thing. So it's like let's like not be hesitant to that. I mean, it's a cliche to say it should be the Department of Food at this point. But also like personal matters. Um, Imagine if we put someone who's run a school district cafeteria program as Secretary of Agriculture. I mean, that would be such a game changer. Like, is this revolving door of industrial hacks that keep filling the Secretary of Agriculture position, even though I mean we all eat and 1 in 10 Americans work in the food system, but it's so geared towards there's this small slice of it.
You talked, well, I don't think we got to talk about it, but what is the bipartisan opportunity? I mean, are there a lot of folks on either side of the aisle that are interested in more regulation on these monopolies and on addressing some of the broken parts of the agricultural department's?
Yeah, I mean, the two things I see are one, it's just you see a lot of Republicans from Great Plains State talking a lot about meatpacking just because to me the hog family farm died in my lifetime and essentially the dairy family farm has too. The rancher's kind of the only one standing at this point and they're screaming for help. Um their markets are consolidating. Their spot market, which is for people who don't know what spot market is, it's like think of it like eBay. Like you take your cattle to like a place and people bid for it. Um, Companies really don't like that. They want to move you to production contracts so that way you don't know what anyone else is being paid. So it really, it's kind of like if you've ever been to an auction, you get carried away on eBay. We've all done that. They try to kill those markets. There used to be a hog spot market, and that was killed. So you have all these Republicans screaming for help. Why not, meet their rhetoric and try to do something? At the same time, too, you're actually seeing a lot of Republican-leaning think tanks in DC, like the Heritage and Cato Institutes, really kind of come out against the Farm Bill. I mean, the crop insurance has become such a gluttonous corporate giveaway that they're kind of even done with it. And so to me, it's like for Democrats, why not join with just a handful of, Republicans like that, Mitt Romney Republicans, and just sunset the Farm Bill? Why are you supporting a program that's destructive to the climate and doesn't do anything to address high grocery store prices?
My head is spinning now with all these ways that folks might be able to get involved on an advocacy level if they feel strongly about this. What can they do at a more local level or a day to day? How do we solve some of these agricultural problems, in our own community?
Yeah, so three things come to my mind. One, we talked a little bit about this, but procurement. Um, the farmer doing it right, the person at the farmer's market you like, pair them up with an institutional buyer. I mean, schools, colleges, they buy a lot of food. And, you really help stabilize those businesses because a lot of farmers sell privately. They don't like doing the farmer's market. They get rained out. It's not consistent income. So help do that. And also understand too, it's good politics. Who doesn't want their kids eating dairy, produced in a sustainable way? Um, the second thing is I'm a big believer in reach out to journalists. I do that personally where if you see certain industry hacks being quoted or like, things framed a certain way or certain stories not being told, just send a nice email. Like, be conscious of your tone. But like I personally what I realized writing this book is every commodity has a certain go-to hack that just does the bidding of the corporation. And like in hogs, it's Dermot Hayes at Iowa State. This man doesn't disclose to journalists that he, not only does he take a ton of industry money that you see disclosed when he is an expert witness, but he's also like, he literally does business transactions with my hog barons. He doesn't disclose this. So like I personally would email journalists like, hey, you should know that this person, and guess what? Journalists usually don't cite them anymore. Or a lot of times they're just, moving a mile a minute, not paid a lot, and let them know like, hey, you should really talk to this person, or you should really know this. Or, I mean, this is kind of a dark, funny example, but that mulcher scene in Fargo?
Yeah.
A confinement industrial hog person was doing that in Western Iowa to his hogs. And a woman in Western Iowa first called the Iowa Department of Natural Resources. They didn't do anything. So she went to the local TV stations and they did a story on it. And finally, he was fined and said not to do that. You got to lean into this. Honestly, got to lean into the gorilla versus Goliath framework. Like you're never going to be dollar for dollar against these giants, these barons. But you got to like lean into the theater. That's also why I intentionally opened my book with this woman named Julie Dunn of Eldora, Iowa, because she's fighting the hog baron. That's what she's done in her retirement. And the second you give up is when they win. And sure, she most times she doesn't win, but it's her constant persistence fighting for like a better future for her grandchildren. So it keeps her going. And honestly, it's a sense of community for her. I mean, that's why to go full circle, she's from near Iowa Falls, where my hog baron's from. And that book event, I got town of 5,000 Iowa. I got 50 people for a book event. Like, you're lucky to get that in like New York City for a book event. And that was like people who have the faith in her. You know what I mean? Like, they are galvanized by her. And it's just, I think people want to feel like they can take on power and move the ball forward and kind of lean into it. I don't know. It's really easy to be dark and shut down, but you got to just you got to fight for the system you want. Because to me, the system has run its course. And the question is, where do we go from here?
Well, Austin, thank you so much today for sharing all of this research, your insights, and some suggestions for us how we can move forward, because it does sometimes feel daunting when you read about all of these big players in this industry, and all we want is quality, nutritious, good food. And it seems like that's harder and harder to find here in the United States. So what's next for you? Is there a follow-up book in the works?
Oh, who knows? I mean, the funny thing about doing this book tour, doing these different things, is people, first of all, they come up and tell me either, hey, let me tell you about this baron you should know about. It's like when I was in Minnesota book event, people were telling me about a potato baron. Or people, they read my book and they're like, hey, you should really know about this. Like, I actually had that happen a lot with Walmart suppliers. They'll send me a private email. Hey, I want to tell you about this exploitive thing. So I just kind of keep a list going. So we'll see. I mean, I'll play with it a little bit more. I've been kind of thinking about, like, I'm really interested in Cisco as like a distribution baron. They are those trucks you see in front of every restaurant. But mostly, my big goal is like turn this book into a docuseries. I just feel the visual of this stuff is just incredible. Like, I can't put into words the visualness of some of these stories. You just got to see it for yourself.
Well, sign me up. I'll watch it for sure. Thanks again, Austin. I really appreciate your time today and your insights. And thank you all for listening. Enlightened Omnivore is this our second podcast. We'll have many, many more over the course of this year. And definitely check out Austin's book. It's a fabulous read. You can find it wherever books are sold and on Audible now, which I listen to. So fantastic. And that wraps up another episode of Enlightened Omnivore. A special thanks to all my subscribers for listening in this week. You can all read more about everything omnivorous on my weekly Substack newsletter found at enlightenedomnivore.substack.com. Stay curious, keep exploring, and join me next month as we continue to uncover the stories behind our food and the new ways we can live sustainably together. Thank you for tuning in. This is Steve Sabaker reminding you to savor every bite and eat mindfully. Until next time, keep it balanced and stay enlightened. This is Enlightened Omnivore. Everything in moderation.